Hello everyone, thanks for joining us here today. I'm pleased to talk about a passion project of mine, a qualitative case study examining the organizational goal trajectory of an Indigenous political and policy organization, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, or the ICC, in the 21st century. So I'll start out by giving an overview of the project's background, the broader project it's nestled within, and an overview of the key players and contexts, which will then take us into the methodological considerations. These are the overview of strengths and gaps of several considered approaches, followed by an overview of the project's ultimate research design, involving a foundational frequentative analysis, subsequent thematic analysis conducted through a narrative fidelity approach, and then merged with other data streams to enhance finding validity. I'll go through the main findings of the projects, the trends and the goals disseminated by the ICC to its fellow political and policy organizations from the late 2000s to early 2010s, and then conclude with a discussion on impacts, both the impacts and implications of the findings themselves for the ICC and broader Arctic studies, as well as covering some method-specific considerations for other projects that may consider what qualitative analysis approaches may be appropriate for their scope. So to start with the project background. First, the area. The Arctic is a remarkable political hinterlands. While it's geographically distinct from most global political hubs, it's increasingly centered in global economics and politics. Major states have increasingly indicated an openness and dedication to international cooperation in the Arctic, which has resulted in the creation of several Arctic forums, the largest of which, with the strongest reputation, is the Arctic Council. Then, the project. So the project I'm talking about here today is a component of a broader project on the strategies Arctic Indigenous political and activist organizations use to punch above their weight in shaping the agendas of international forums, where more traditionally powerful nations also sit. The broader project scope looks at the activities of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents Inuit from across Northern America, Greenland, and Russia, and the Sami Council, which represents the indigenous peoples of Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula within the Arctic Council, where indigenous nations and the 8 Arctic nation states develop voluntary and binding agreements on Arctic economic, political, and energy activity. And then the actors. Today's talk focuses on a more manageable chunk of the broader project scope, looking at ICC goals disseminated to these international partners and audiences across 3 seminal texts, each representing the organization's primary goals and areas of interest. And this component specifically seeks to identify the goals the ICC advances to and prioritizes within these international spaces, to see whether these environmental, economic, and political changes take place over time. So careful articulation of goals is critical for ICC. As a non-state actor representing a population of about 200,000 across the world, it has far more limitations in terms of money, resources, staff, and other non-tangible institutional goods compared to state Arctic actors, like the US, Russia, or Sweden. It therefore needs to really critically prioritize its goals and the strategies it uses to pursue them. Because it's a non-state actor representing a non-state nation, Inuit peoples, a group not well recognized in international law, it faces an uphill battle in traditional conceptions of power and influence. As a result, the ICC has worked within the Arctic since the 1970s to create governance structures, voluntary treaties, agreement forums that favor soft law structures, those that value norms and promote specific ideas about the way Arctic actors ought to act, instead of hard law, which favors those traditionally powerful states. So, I ended up conducting a narrative and thematic content analysis on 3 ICC reports published from 2008 to 2011. Here, I'll talk more about the process of designing and conducting the qualitative analysis. So the 3 ICC reports examined within the project are the ICC's 3 declarations, outputs that usually only nation states produce. The Sea Ice is Our Highway from 2008, A Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty in the Arctic from 2009, and A Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Resource Development Principles in Inuit Nunaat from 2011. Each was the culmination of multi-year, cross-national research conducted by ICC and local partners. In other words, they were lengthy, expensive endeavors, the kinds of things a resource-disadvantaged organization would be wary of engaging if they didn't believe they're worth. The Sea Ice is Our Highway focuses on the centrality of sea ice as a geographical feature in Inuit culture and livelihood. A Circumpolar Inuit Declaration advances the understanding of the Arctic as Inuit's ancestral land and the right of the Inuit nation at large to exert sovereignty over it. And A Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Resource Development Principles sets out the principles on resource development that calls for an Inuit role in governance, management, and development of resources. The texts range from 2 to 32 pages, and I sought to break down their themes into distinct framings. So in particular, within this presentation, I'm going to focus on some examples from The Sea Ice is Our Highway, division into themes that characterized or depicted the nature of interactions between shipping and northern peoples. So while the declarations weren't developed specifically for targeted forums, they were developed for the purpose of articulating Indigenous needs and informing future deliberations, as well as to be used as references for centering principles by the organization itself. So I wanted to examine the production of history through analyzing the production and content of meaningful communications, in line with Trullo, 1995, allowing us to discover how the exercise of power makes some narratives or interests possible while silencing others. So I knew I needed to use tools that could navigate through extensive text imbued with political meaning, in archival form, interviews, and these key reports. I also knew that while thematic analysis would be a major component of the role, I'd need to go a step beyond frequentative analysis, which just identifies broad themes and their predominance, to make sure I was choosing an approach that allowed a more nuanced treatment of the themes. So I ended up applying a 4-step process. First, I began with a frequentative analysis of each document, identifying their major themes as neutral issue areas. This presented an initial view into the frequency in which these specific goals appeared in the direct ICC outputs and their distribution across the texts. I conducted basic thematic coding based upon a priori and emergent codes. In The Sea Ice is Our Highway, for example, there were 3 a priori codes adapted from the 3 overarching themes identified in its introduction: tradition and adaptation, standards of sustainable use, and linkages between geophysical features and human practices. The remainder of the codes were emergent, which identified value-neutral issue areas as subject, without going into treatment or framing, to identify the frequency of issues raised at their highest level. So I ended up identifying the 5 most frequent themes across the 4 texts, as well as the 5 most frequent themes within each text, and then moved to a next stage qualitative thematic analysis. That's where I brought these themes down into further distinct framings, bringing treatment into the picture. So if these most frequent themes identified within and across texts, I went into this thematic analysis to make sense of prioritized goals through richly described themed findings. So this could be illustrated in the example of moving from shipping as a category to specific positive or negative characterizations or depictions of the nature of interactions between shipping and northern peoples. For example, shipping as a benefit by providing resources to isolated communities, or shipping as a threat by disrupting marine mammal migration patterns. So to go beyond simple content description, I used axial coding, where initial open coding, which breaks codes into discrete parts, is followed by examining codes in relation to one another. Codes are grouped by the frequency of their appearance and treatment given in text, with these axial or central codes becoming elevated to the thematic categories. So to provide an example of the transition from theme to thematic, here's a breakdown of the theme of shipping interactions with human behavior, which was a key theme present in The Sea Ice is Our Highway and A Circumpolar Declaration. So it could be broken down into 6 themes. Notably, they don't exist on a spectrum of shipping has positive effects to shipping has negative effects. Instead, they demonstrate different treatments or attitudes towards shipping as an event that brings about consequences. For example, this first category, shipping in the Arctic, is believed to be something that could bring about 2 ways of looking at or portraying Inuit culture. One treatment is that Inuit culture is malleable. It's not static, but instead changes over time, and is therefore capable of adapting to physical and social changes that come with increased shipping and any consequences it brings. On the other hand, another narrative is that while there might be aspects of Inuit culture that evolve, there are core principles that need to be maintained in order for the culture to have continuity with the past, aspects that cannot and should not change as a result of shipping in the Arctic. So they're not necessarily opposite ends of the spectrum, but depending on the aspect of culture focused on, can result in a different narrative. So to continue this example, when we look at the textual space of the CSSR highway, we can see the prevalence of each of these themes within the text. Of the identified issue areas, there were 6 main treatments, the most prevalent of which was a treatment of embodied sustainability. The idea that sustainability as a behavior and concept is natural. It's an inherent value or practice. So with the most frequent themes identified in their text and their meanings more fully fleshed out through rich description thematic analysis, I conducted a narrative fidelity analysis on 3 texts. So a text had fidelity if its content was faithful in the framing and treatment of prior source texts. So when evaluated in the context of a series of reports, we would expect the subject presence of topics across all texts in the treatment or narrative to remain relatively the same for it to have fidelity. And then finally, I conducted a similar process of thematic text and content analysis on interviews and archival analysis of past ICC meeting minutes to identify major interests, concerns, and prescriptions, and checking the emergent codes through interviews with ICC staff offered greater reliability in identifying which values in the declaration were most important to authors through data merging. So from this process, I identified 3 topics that were most heavily prevalent within the texts and articulated their treatment changes or fidelity over time. First, over the course of their reports, ICC increasingly prioritized the importance of Inuit playing a role in northern infrastructure development and resource supply. Second, it steadily decreased emphasis on goals relating to decreasing Arctic shipping, which was a fairly dramatic decrease from the first to last report. And finally, there remained a relatively steady and frequent promotion of Indigenous organizational membership in international forums based upon the justification of Indigenous organizations being beneficial contributors based on their embodied sustainability. See, looking at this first theme, increasing prioritization of northern infrastructure development and resource supply, was addressed across all texts though treatment of it evolved over time. Earlier texts framed infrastructure development and resource supply through a lens of constraint, that state, industry, and other actors should critically evaluate whether projects were necessary and beneficial before undertaking them. Yet later texts contain a shift away from such language. While there was a need to evaluate projects, there was a much stronger emphasis on ensuring Indigenous and rural communities participated in all levels of planning such projects. In fact, there's almost a total reversal from the first to the last text in how the consequences of infrastructure and research supply, from listing nearly all negative effects, including pollution and marine mammal disruption, to nearly all positive effects, supplementing country food, increasing standards of living, were portrayed. And finally, the last text was the first to advance a concrete framework for integrating Indigenous communities in infrastructure consultation. Next, across the text, there was a steadily decreasing emphasis on goals related to decreasing Arctic shipping. This was marked by 2 trends. First, the amount of textual space dedicated to shipping as a general phenomenon decreased by about 75%. And when it was discussed, it had a very different treatment than prior texts, shifting from curtailing shipping to carefully managing the industry, which called for Indigenous and rural communities to participate in regulation creation, or to have veto capacity. In establishing the body of knowledge and data that would inform decisions, the ICC urged that Indigenous and traditional knowledge be accepted as legitimate data alongside other forms of Western scientific data. And finally, ICC called for the development of international standards guiding industry obligations and recourses to communities affected by shipping. And finally, throughout all the reports, there remained a steady promotion of Indigenous organizational membership in new international forums based upon embodied sustainability. That characterization of sustainability that's central to a way of life or embodied in one's nature. And so while both conscientious sustainability, the idea that sustainability comes about from intentional decision making, and embodied sustainability characterizations are contained within the reports, there is an overwhelming emphasis on Inuit practicing embodied sustainability. It's the Inuit position that any action or intervention that affects their land must protect the environment and wildlife, and therefore the Inuit people, in such a way that they can continue to live off the land for thousands more years. This self-description of sustainability fidelity reputation is a tactic used in Indigenous internationalization strategies, a narrative to justify belonging in international forums based upon the unique perspectives they lend to political, economic, and environmental discussions. So from this identification of the ICC's three main goals and treatment over time, I want to finish by discussing the lessons learned from this project, the impact for scholarship and practice, as well as specific methodological lessons from this process. First, within the field of international relations, and especially within Arctic studies, there's been an increasingly closer examination of the evolving ways actors try to articulate and advance their goals, especially when there are international actors who don't meet the traditional criteria of international actors from a realist perspective. In turning our focus to the Arctic, a space recognized as a singular region in international relations as in large part due to space-making efforts of circumpolar indigenous peoples, we expand our lens on actors of consequence in a way that encompasses internationality. We do so with the belief that even non-state nations can inform soft law development, defining core concepts that make up the basis of international agreements or rights, or defining class of actors. Within international relations, there's been a shift in constructivist and liberal theory that examines how certain geopolitical regions develop tendencies to advance hard or soft law. The Arctic is widely considered to be a region with one of the most developed soft law structures, something interesting given that 2 of the 8 Arctic states are the US and Russia. Indigenous actors developing goals articulated in the international sphere implies the accepted legitimacy of soft law structures. In terms of impacting Arctic policy, hindsight has shown that the ICC has utilized its policy and research multifunctionality many times after each report's publication. Therefore, multifunctionality has been a meaningful result of the ICC strategy. As the ICC developed its own in-depth data set to create each report, it bore all costs, logistics, and provided expertise. Each report did draw some data from pre-existing studies, but also conducted extensive interviews and case studies. So by examining such reports as reports and contributory documents for longer-term state-to-state campaigning, policy analysts can seriously examine ideological content within organizational processes, movements, and significant texts. Additionally, the ICC is among the best funded and staffed Arctic Indigenous associations. Others, such as the Sami Council and Arctic Athabascan Association, can learn from and adopt successful strategies in order to increase their own influence in international forums. And finally, on the research design side of things, this project led to some lessons learned in methodological decision-making. Frequentative analysis as a precursor to subsequent qualitative analysis, whether thematic, content, narrative, or other, is a good strategy to focus in on the scope of analysis. In this particular case, I conducted a manual analysis, combing through the text in their entirety, and then conducting a machine search for keywords and synonyms using a qualitative analysis software program. I chose to do initial manual analysis because the 3 reports did comprise a reasonable amount of text, though anyone using software to comb through text will want to look into strategies to optimize the search and minimize the risk of missing data points of interest. And throughout this work, critical thematic analysis was conducted along narrative fidelity analysis to try to unravel the textual perpetuation of group interests. Critical thematic analysis has advanced useful concepts like discourse continuity and intertextuality that bring attention to the various ways that content persists along multiple text development. The combination of the 2 steps helped me optimize time throughout the analysis and ended up really being an excellent way to bring in some of the strengths of text as data approaches, while really getting to interact with the nuances of subject treatment through a deductive approach and being able to produce some rich description. One caveat to this approach is that it was conducted as a primary data stream, but still supported by additional streams, from interviews with ICC representatives and activists, as well as archival analysis of over 1,000 pages from ICC's digital archives. That these 3 main trends were also present in these other data streams enhances the findings' trustworthiness. When using a frequentative analysis to narrow in the scope of analyzed text, it becomes particularly important to bring in these other streams or validation measures to enhance the quality of the work. So I want to thank you all very much for your presence here today and for this opportunity to talk about this project. If you have any questions, I look forward to hearing them today, or if you want to reach out to me, you can certainly do so at my email here. Thank you all very much.